Hello, greetings, and welcome. I'm Brien Posey, and in this video, I want to talk about kind of a weird topic. I want to talk about PowerShell drives. Now, the reason why I say that PowerShell drives is a weird topic is because the subject of drives seems so simplistic on the surface. As a matter of fact, when I was first learning about computers way back in the 1980s, drive mappings were one of the very first lessons that I can remember learning. And back then, the lesson was if you want to access the B drive, type B:, you want to access the A drive, type A:. Hard drives and the C drive weren't really a thing back then. But that same basic concept still applies today. Back then we had to boot the machine into DOS, but PowerShell uses a lot of the same commands that were left over from the days of DOS. For example, this machine is equipped with an R drive, so I could type R:, and I access the R drive. And if I want to go back to the C drive, I just type C:, and I'm back in the C drive. So the same basic rules that we had way back in the 1980s still apply today with regard to PowerShell. So why am I taking the time to record a video on PowerShell drives if that's the case? Well, it's because when you start dealing with drive mappings in PowerShell, some really weird things happen. Microsoft has kind of changed the rules along the way. So I want to show you something odd that you may run into in PowerShell with regard to drive mappings, and I'll show you a workaround. And then I'm also going to show you a handy shortcut that you can use, and I'm talking about something that was impossible to do back in the days of DOS. So let's go ahead and get into it. So the first thing that I want to show you is the anomaly that I talked about a moment ago. It's the odd behavior that you may experience with regard to network drives in PowerShell. Let me go ahead and minimize my PowerShell window for just a second and switch over to Windows File Explorer. So here we are in File Explorer, and you can see the drives that exist on this PC. So I've got a C drive, I've got a D drive that contains a Blu-ray disc, I've got an R drive and a W drive, and then I've got a couple of map network drives. I've got a Q drive and I've got an I drive. So let's focus on the I drive. There's really nothing special about this drive. It's just a mapping to a share on a file server where I store ISO files. But for the sake of demonstration, let's use this drive. So as you can see, this drive is mapped on the PC. If I double click on it, we can access its contents, no problem at all. So with that said, let me go ahead and switch back over to PowerShell. So here we are in PowerShell, and I just showed you a moment ago how we can access local drives. Once again, I could access the R drive by typing R:, and pressing enter. I could access the W drive by typing W:, and pressing enter. And I could go back to the C drive by typing C:, and pressing enter. But what about that I drive, the one that maps to a network location? Well, if I type I:, and press enter, I get an error. And it says that a drive with the name I doesn't exist. So why is that? Well, as weird as it sounds, this particular error is related to the fact that I'm working in an elevated PowerShell session. If you look right here, you can see the word administrator. This indicates that the PowerShell session is indeed elevated. If I open up a secondary non-elevated PowerShell window and I try the same thing, you won't see the error. Let's go ahead and do that. So here I am in another PowerShell window, and you'll notice the absence of the word administrator up in the tab, meaning that this is just a standard PowerShell window. I'm not operating as administrator. And let's do the same thing that we just did. I'll type R:, and I'm in the R drive. I'll go to W. I'm in the W drive. Now let's try I. And I'm able to access the I drive. If I type get child item and press enter, I see the contents of that map network drive. Now, this is kind of an interesting dilemma because if you think about it, I mentioned that this particular disk contains a bunch of ISO files, and ISO files are often used by administrators when they have to install a piece of software. And yet, I can't access this drive containing all of my ISO files from an elevated PowerShell session. So what can I do as a workaround in order to be able to access this drive from an elevated PowerShell session? Well, at the very beginning of this video, I talked about the days of DOS, and I mentioned that there are a lot of commands that are built into PowerShell that are leftovers from the days of DOS. We can actually use one of those commands in order to gain access to a mapped network drive from an elevated PowerShell session. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to switch over to my elevated session, and I'm going to type net use. And again, this is an old DOS command that has been ported into PowerShell, so we don't have to use the dash because it's not a true PowerShell commandlet. So if I were to type net -use, that would produce an error. I need net space use. Then I have to type the drive letter that I want to use. Now, I had used the iDrive, and I'm going to use that again, but because an elevated PowerShell session is unaware of network drive mappings, we could actually use any drive letter we want as long as it's not used for a local drive. But I'm going to go ahead and use I. So there's I colon, and then I just have to type the UNC path that I want to map I colon to. So in this case, it's / / 147.100.100.151/ISO. And I'll press enter, and I'm prompted to enter some credentials. I'm going to pause the video for just a second while I do that. Okay, so I've entered my credentials and I cleared the screen. And so now if I type I colon and press enter, now I can access the iDrive even though I'm in an elevated PowerShell session. And if I type get child item and press enter, I can access the contents of that drive. So that's a workaround that you can use to get access to a map network drive from an elevated PowerShell session. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that Microsoft has kind of changed some of the rules when it comes to PowerShell drives, and that there's a handy trick that you can use to make it a little bit easier to access some of your files. So let me show you what that trick looks like. I'm going to switch back over to my C drive, and as a matter of fact, just to make things interesting, I'm going to go ahead and close out my elevated PowerShell window, and I'm going to do everything from a standard PowerShell session. So let me switch over to my C drive, and I'll type cd / and press enter, and that drops me down to the root folder. And I've got a folder on this machine called scripts. So I'm going to type cd and then scripts, and that puts me in the scripts folder. And this folder just contains a bunch of PowerShell scripts. You can see what some of those look like. So as you saw, I had to use a few different commands to gain access to the scripts folder. Now, that's not normally a big deal, but the scripts folder is something that I use all of the time. But what we can do is map a drive letter to the scripts folder so that we can access it directly. So let me show you how this works. Before I do, I need to introduce you to yet another PowerShell commandlet. This commandlet is get-psdrive. And this is a true PowerShell commandlet, not a leftover DOS commandlet. I'll press enter. And what this command does is it shows you all of the drives that PowerShell is aware of. So let's take a look at some of this. Here we have the C drive. We also have the R drive and the W drive that you saw earlier. And we even have our network drive mappings. Here's the I drive, and here's the Q drive that you saw within File Explorer. So everything that was visible in File Explorer is visible here when I type get-psdrive. Now there are also some items that didn't show up in File Explorer. If you look at the provider column, you can see that some of these drives are mapped to the file system. For example, the C drive is part of the file system. However, there are non-file system mappings here. For example, we have registry drives. So here's HKey local machine, and the provider is listed as registry. Likewise, we have HKey current user, the provider is listed as registry. And we have drives that are mapped to the registry. So we have HKLM is the name of a drive, and HKCU is the name of a drive. So I just wanted to give you a quick overview on that. Now, I mentioned earlier that I've got a folder named scripts, and that you can actually map a drive directly to the scripts folder as a way of simplifying access to that folder. So let me show you how that works. What I'm going to do is use another PowerShell commandlet called new-psdrive. New-psdrive. And this command is used to create new drive mappings. So the first thing that we have to do is to provide a name for the drive mapping. So I'm going to type space-name, and then we specify what we want to call this drive. Now, traditionally with the old DOS-style drive names, which Windows still uses today, we use the letters of the alphabet. So the C drive is typically the boot drive. But you'll notice if you look at the output from the get-psdrive command, we're not restricted to using just letters of the alphabet. We can use words in place of drive letters. So that's what I'm going to do here. Rather than mapping a drive letter to the scripts folder, I'm just going to call this scripts. The next thing that we have to do is specify the PS provider. And I showed you the PS provider column. It specifies whether a mapping is related to the file system, the registry, a certificate, or something else. So I'm going to type -PS provider, and I'm going to set the provider equal to file system. And then the last thing that we have to do is to provide a path for the drive mapping. So I'm going to type -root, and then I need to specify the path, and that path specification has to be enclosed in quotation marks. So I'll type quotation mark, and then C:/scripts, and quotation mark, and I'll press enter, and the drive mapping has been completed. So now if I type get-psdrive and press enter, you can see that I now have a drive called scripts. When you're accessing a PowerShell drive, you have to type the drive name followed by a colon. I showed you how to access regular drives like C and R. You would simply type the letter of the alphabet, like R, and then followed by a colon, and press enter, and that takes you to the drive. But if we do that with the scripts drive that we just created, it doesn't quite work. Let me show you what I mean. If I type scripts, colon, and I press enter, I get an error message. So how do we access the scripts drive? Well, the way that we do that is by using the cd command. The cd command, which you saw earlier, is normally used to change the directory. So you can use the cd command to move up and down levels within the directory structure. And normally all of that is done within the currently selected drive. But you can actually use the cd command to switch to a different drive in PowerShell. So if I want to access the scripts folder, I type cd and then scripts colon, and the colon is important. I'll press enter, and now I'm in the scripts folder. And if I type get child item, you see the contents of that folder. Now it's worth noting that you can also remove a PowerShell drive, and that's super simple to do. All you have to do is type remove-psdrive, -name, and then the drive name without the colon at the end. So I'll type scripts and press enter, and I get an error message because I'm actually in that drive right now. So let's go ahead and switch to a different drive. I'll switch over to C, and let's try the command again. So this time the removal was successful, and if I type get-psdrive, you can see that the scripts drive has been removed. So that's how you work with drives in PowerShell. I'm Brien Posey. Thanks for watching.